Today we have with us Amrut. He's a very good friend, but he's also an amazing founder and CEO. He leads ThingsCloud, a clean tech hardware startup, and he's done some really cool stuff at his startup. And we'll get to know more about him when we talk to him today. So welcome Amrut, and pleasure to have you here today.
Yeah, it's always pleasure to chat up with you because we go a long ways. So
great.
It's fun.
Amazing. So like he said, we've definitely been, we've known each other for a long time, and
from
we've been
SLB, I think, yes, right? SLB.
Yes. So we started with startup leadership. I think we discussed a lot about our respective startups as well. So it's been an amazing journey at SLB, and even after that, I've been talking to you about the problems we've had at my startup, and vice versa. And I think you've been really helpful at some of those things. And I'm sure today a lot of people will find a lot of value in what you have to share today.
Hopefully.
So let's start from the beginning. Tell our audience a little bit about yourself. What you've done, where you come from, and how did you end up starting a company?
So that's a long journey of stories and multiple stories. So if you look at where I come from, I actually come from a farming community from Karnataka, and I born and brought up in the Sagar, Shimoga. Then I went to NIT Pharma Engineering, NIT Surat. So that is where I kind of started understanding what is the word of startups are, how do you kind of really create a value for the customer and build a new product of it. Okay. Otherwise, probably that is where the transformation is, like studying in the NIT. And then after that I went to US for my masters.
Nice.
And particularly it is Austin, because the reason why I want to bring up Austin is there is so much of startup energies in Austin.
It is.
After the Silicon Valley, the next best place to be in is Austin.
Now, I've been to Austin and it's quite amazing. I mean, the vibe there is
great food, great music. Like almost every restaurants have somebody playing music all the time.
And I think the clubs are open there until almost 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. in the midnight.
Almost next day, 24/7. All the it's a university town, and also it's a town where there is a lot of innovation.
True.
And lot of hardware startups are there in Austin, particularly
nice.
Because there is a Samsung Semiconductor is there. Motorola or Freescale had a huge place. AMD had a huge place. Intel had a huge place. So there is a lot of the hardware ecosystem that is built up in Austin, particularly around hardware is created by all these companies in that. Like how the Google, Facebooks and other companies created Silicon Valley, the hardware ecosystem was created in Austin.
Awesome.
So that's where I kind of got the flavor of hardware, and I worked in companies like, for example, Extreme Power. These are the battery manufacturers for large scale wind turbines.
Okay.
Back in the days 2009-10, there was wind energy boom, particularly in West Texas. And if you understand the wind patterns, typically wind blows mostly in the night, so you need to have large amount of storage to store it so that you can use it in the morning.
Right.
That's where my introduction, particularly to the clean energy, came into the picture. So working there for 2-3 years, that's when I realized like how you build a startup and take it from zero. Okay. And then I came back to India and worked in another startup, which is again in the clean tech. And now this startup was particularly Navsemi, which is in the solar. That's when I got introduced to the solar, and working closely with the founder, I realized like how do you really develop a business model, value proposition, and raise funding. So Navsemi raised funding from XLX Singapore. They raised around a couple of $1 million, and they got acquired in 2013-14.
Okay,
after the acquisition, the thought for the ThingsCloud came in, and then the birth and the journey of ThingsCloud happened.
Amazing.
But mostly I've been in the startup ecosystem of building products and hardware for almost like 8-10 years now.
Okay.
You can say that, yeah.
So is it fair to say that you were meant to do something in this space, because the fact that you were in Austin, which was a hardware hub,
yes,
you worked for a company which was into clean energy, and then finally for a company which was into solar. So what you finally started was an amalgamation of all these, right?
Yeah, you can say that it's an amalgamation of that, and naturally my interest was also in that area because I grew up in a very small, like in a village where we had more than 6 to 7 hours of power cuts every day.
Okay.
So I grew up studying in kerosene lamps. So
okay.
I understood the pain of not having power.
Okay.
And what happens is when the solution for this country's power problem cannot be solved by building large coal power plants. Even building a coal power plant will take around 7 to 8 years, and operationalizing will take more than a decade.
Right.
Coal or hydroelectric takes 20 years. But if you look at the house, if you can put up a solar on your rooftop under 15 days, and you can be completely self-sufficient, reliant, 24/7 power with solar, and it's probably right now the cheapest form of generating electricity.
Nice.
Only capex is the issue, but that problem will be solved. But overall, what is very important is that will solve the country's energy needs.
Nice.
And more, if you look at India as a country, so we consume anywhere between, I think right now around 1000 or 1500 units of electricity per year. If you look at US, they consume around 17,000 units of electricity.
Okay.
And this is not including the EV into the picture.
Okay.
So if you add EV into the picture, the country would be at around 30,000 units per year. Okay. And it's transitioning more towards that. So we have to grow almost 30x of our power requirement.
Right.
And India is a country with 1 billion, it will be more than that.
Obviously.
You cannot solve this problem any other way other than distributed power generation from the clean energy.
Makes sense.
That's the only natural recourse of way that people need to go forward to solve the real problem at a fundamentally distributed level.
Nice. Okay. So you said, the motivation to start this came from your own home. Was this the major motivation to start ThingsCloud, or did you have some other occurrences of incidents which made you realize that I need to start ThingsCloud, I need to start a company in this clean tech space?
So what happened is, like when we look into the market space, when the acquisition happened with an Navsemi and Alpha, so the primary focus of the company became US.
Okay.
But what we realized is that there is a large burning problem in India that needs to be solved. And no matter what, I was hell bent on solving that problem.
Okay.
And building the products to solve that problem from the tech angle. So that is one of the motivations. And then it's always been, I always wanted to be in the place where I am actually solving the problem and forefront of technology. Yeah. So that is
I'm getting some Elon Musk vibes here now.
No, Elon Musk is at a different level altogether. We are just a speck of dust in.
But I see the passion in you when it comes to actually addressing the problem of power and doing it through clean tech, and that is something which Elon Musk shares as well. So I think you're doing a commendable job on that. The fact that in India obviously it's challenging.
Yes.
Especially hardware startups, especially a startup itself is challenging. Yes. And after that, doing a hardware startup is going to be challenging. So what are the challenges you faced in your startup in your early days?
So in a fundamental problem, as you say, in the hardware startup, first running a startup is challenging. Now the ecosystem is far more better than 3 or 4 years ago. That is first part. Second part is the hardware is much more challenging, because anytime when you go to raise funding, people will ask, how do you compete with China? Because India, whatever said and done, it is still the manufacturing ecosystem is not as mature as in China.
Right.
And there is always a threat of the Chinese company coming into the India and disrupting the market and driving the price to zero.
Makes sense.
Or very, very competitive.
Right.
So that is one of the bigger challenges in a hardware startup, particularly if you are operating in India. But if you have large capital, that problem is not as much it is there. But and also you have a differentiated software along with it. You can actually cater to the threat. But there is a threat for Indian hardware startups, because fundamentally the scale that China brings, it is very difficult for India to bring it in the near future.
Right.
The government is doing production linked subsidy, all these things, but it will take some time.
Makes
but
sense.
Yes, it is there. There is an entry barrier for the Indian startup to be operating in the hardware space.
Okay. So how did you address that? I mean, the very fact that there is a Chinese swords hanging over your neck, and then there's always this concerns which investors would show about whether you'll be successful or not. So how did you address that, and how did you ensure that you're growing as well?
So one thing is that even if the Chinese company can build product, they will not understand the market.
Right.
The customer pain or the customer problem that is something that has to be well defined if we have to take up any company.
Right.
So because right now the world is a flat, anybody can compete anywhere. The only way for any startup to succeed, no matter which country where they come from, competition is about the understanding of the customer and always be in touch with the customer,
Right.
and constantly innovate for the customer to solve the problem.
Right.
As long as you are on the cutting edge of the customer problem, you are fine still.
Right.
So that is still okay.
So when you're starting up, and I mean, a lot of entrepreneurs, vouch for, they adopt the models like, lean startup model or business canvas models. So in your case, have you seen or have you used them and have you found them to be successful?
Oh yeah, lean startup model is something that definitely has helped us, because if we cannot measure something fast enough, then it's difficult to see whether we are going right or not. Lean startup is something that I think is very, very helpful, particularly in the hardware startup, because the cycle time for the product market is much longer. So you have to really quickly get something outside the door and test the market and then double down on it,
Right.
because there's no recourse for that.
Right.
So lean startup is something that is consistently I really believe that at least hardware startup should focus on lean startup,
Right.
and quickly get something out of the door,
Got it.
because you never know the difference in the software and the hardware product life cycle is in the software you can just fix it overnight.
Right.
In the hardware, if you design a product wrong, you are probably like 6 months to 8 months away
Makes sense.
from making the next iteration. So
Makes sense.
it is before you double down, you want to make sure that you have got the product market fit.
Got it.
The only way you can get it is you actually go to the market and validate that hypothesis that whatever product that has been developed that is been validated in the market.
Right.
So lean startup is absolutely paramount on that. I think these things we went in the SLP.
Yes, we did.
We had so much brainstorming on that.
True.
That and all is very helpful.
So, but I did have one concern about lean startup. I'm not sure if you agree with it. The fact that you develop something, you go to the market, get feedback. I'm not sure if lean startup definitely would work in a case where you're actually coming up with something very innovative, very different, where people may not at that moment feel that that is needed. So I think lean startup works really well for most cases, but when it comes to doing something very innovative, lean startup in that case may fail, because then people, when you go and ask feedback, get feedback from people on things which are actually not even there, which people have not even thought about, sometimes people are going to give you the wrong feedback.
No, that is where the lean startup comes in, right? You build something which is with minimum viable product. You don't build the full suite of product. You just build something that barely matches the customer requirements.
Right.
Barely solves the problem, not at the full scale.
Right.
And then you get to validate.
But
So
do you
this is-
think lean startup? Do you think if Steve Jobs would have been successful if he had followed the lean startup method? Because he always believed customers don't know what they want.
Steve Jobs, but the difference is you don't.
I realize, of course, Steve Jobs comes once in a billion.
100 years.
Agreed.
That the probability of being Steve Jobs and succeeding is very minuscule, but the probability of building a decent startup is
Using a
very
lean
high
startup
if you go with a
mechanism.
lean startup mechanism, because Steve Jobs is Steve Jobs.
Makes
But
sense.
if you look at Steve Jobs in 1984, he used to build small product computers and sell it.
Right.
He became Steve Jobs in 2002 because he has been doing that for 20 years, actually building MVP product.
Got it.
Steve Jobs in fact sold the product
Right.
without even had the product. If you read his biography.
So let's talk about ThingsCloud now. What do you do? What's your product about? And you did touch upon the fact that you're solving the problem of energy, but
Yes.
then throw a bit more light on exactly what you do.
So at ThingsCloud, fundamentally what we saw is that in the solar market you had predominantly we work on building the inverter tech, which converts the solar to electricity.
Right.
So whatever the solar generates, it is you call it as a DC generation, which is straight. Whatever most of the houses, residential homes consume is AC, alternating current.
Right.
So you need a system that converts the DC to the AC.
Right.
So that is what we, in a very simplistic way, we build tech around it. So we have built, for example, grid tie inverter and we are the only company, I would say, in this country who have built the grid tie inverter from the core tech. We have patents around it.
Nice.
We have innovated a lot on how the Indian grid works and how to make the product actually work much longer for the Indian grids. Because most of the inverters that generally comes to the India is actually imported either from Germany, Israel or China. But if you look at the grid conditions of those countries, those are very stable grids. Germany is fantastic grid, China also is very great grid. The Indian grids is still not at that level. So when you build some technology, it has to be looking at the situations and the realities of the place that we are building.
Right.
So that is where we have pioneered in ThingsCloud, building something that is very niche for the Indian conditions, both climatic conditions, grid conditions, variations in the frequency, variations in the voltage, far higher than any other country in the world.
Right.
Maybe African countries have that kind of thing. So that's where we bring in our value proposition. We're building something that for the country, made in India.
Great. So a lot of people these days are getting into specifically into D2C brands and starting startups around that category. Also exploring. I've seen a lot of people also get into hardware startups. I think the EV boom has actually propelled people getting into hardware, getting interested in hardware, battery technology. So what would your advice be as somebody who's done that and been there for the last 3-4 years? And secondly, what would you advise them against not doing? I think a lot of people talk about what you need to do, but also very important to know what you shouldn't be doing. So what would you tell to such entrepreneurs who are just starting off?
So one is there are two parts to it. One is pure hardware. Second is hardware plus software hybrid. For example, if you look at the EV, there are two parts to it. One is just making batteries. Second is making swap stations where they are actually renting out energy. But if a hardware is, for example, making only pure hardware, then they really have to focus on getting the product to market ASAP. First part. Second part is that they need to ensure that they're protecting the margins.
Right.
Because in software you can have software as a service where you can have a long tail model. So your customer acquisition cost you can spend a lot. In hardware, either you have to figure out how to do a long tail model, which a lot of EV players are doing by doing EV swap stations, or selling a vehicle and then battery as a service.
Right.
Something like that, where it is again becoming a long tail, which is interesting and which would evolve. But if it is a one-time sales, if the product is a one-time sales, then the margins are very important.
Right.
Many times people discount it. Once the margin is gone in hardware, it is unlikely that is going to come back.
Okay.
It is very unlikely. And as long as many of the times the bigger challenges what I see in the VC domain to invest in a pure hardware startup is that if you sell something, for example, if you sell a car, there is no repeat customer. You sell it once and they're gone.
Right.
The reason why they like SaaS or software is that you sell it once, they're coming repeat month after month, year after year.
Right.
That is the biggest entry barrier for the VC world to invest in a hardware startup.
Okay.
Second is when a founder is building a hardware startup, they have to be very, very careful what is their business model.
Got it.
Some of the business models in the hardware startup is unfundable.
Makes sense.
Because they have to look it from the VC perspective also, because many times hardware is subjected to the gravity. You cannot just, if you are manufacturing 100 units, you cannot just manufacture 1000 units next month. It takes finite time. It is not like you are running in AWS, suddenly you just scale it infinitely, like 1 million customer comes, they will not. And same is the problem. If you build for a 1 million customer, if they don't come, then you have a huge inventory.
Makes sense.
So the growth in a hardware startup is also one of the challenges where you have to tune it properly. Otherwise you'll end up with lot of issues.
Makes sense.
So ensuring that the entire operational flow, all the way from product to inventory to the product going to the customer, that has to be very, very tightly controlled. Otherwise you can just easily run out of money.
Makes sense.
Very easily.
Makes sense. Did you have that fear when you were building your company did you think that there could be a point where you may not have money to pay salaries or even do the manufacturing?
Yes, that is always there. That's why we always had a MIS, monthly MIS and monthly cash flow, inventory flow constantly monitored for that.
Okay.
Because very easy to over-invest in the inventory in a hardware startup. Very easy.
Got it.
Unless you put appropriate controls, you can just by the blink of it, you can build a couple of crore worth of inventory just like that. Oh,
Right.
it will just pile up.
Makes
Because
sense.
you are expecting so much customers, so you would procure, because hardware life cycle is generally 3 to 4 months
Right.
from procurement to production to putting it to the market.
Mhm.
That too, with the current component shortages, it's getting longer and longer.
Right.
So that operational aspects of running the company is lot more dynamic and lot more challenging for a hardware startup than
That
a
is.
software startup, because
Right.
software startups only expenses salaries for the people.
Right.
You can scale up or you can scale down. Like for example, you can just fire few people, even though it looks harsh. You can just
Right.
fire few people and reduce the salary burden. In hardware, if you have made a investment on the component, you cannot just,
Yeah, makes
that money is gone, that money is stuck.
Got it.
You either make the product and sell it, or it's gone.
Right.
So that is there, and then there are failures.
Mhm.
Initial product will have failures. That has to be very thought through. You
Makes sense.
overproduce it and then many of it fails, then you have to at your cost replace those products.
Makes sense. Makes
So
sense.
these are some of the challenges that founders have to think very carefully in a
Mhm.
hardware startup, and it's very easy to make mistakes on that. It's like even I have made mistakes in this area.
Mhm.
Nobody will come out of this clean.
Got it.
Everybody
So
will
hold
have
on to
blood
that
on this.
thought. I think we'll come back to your mistakes, but even before that, when you're starting up, there's any startup, any founder will always go through motions and think whether I'm doing the right thing, whether this will work, whether this will be successful. I'm sure you would have gone through those motions as well. So how did you keep yourself motivated? One. Secondly, at what moment you realized that yes, this is the thing, and I am on the path of doing something which is actually going to make a difference, or for the fact that it's going to be a successful startup. So one, how do you realize? What are the moments you went through? And secondly, when do you realize that it's a successful startup?
So one part of it is generally when you have co-founders, it's good to have co-founders in a
True.
startup,
Okay.
and it's good to have good investors in a startup, so that your anxiety, your burden, all those things can be shared, and you have a sounding board,
Right.
which is very very important.
Mhm.
That too, because it is always lonely at the top.
True.
How much ever you say, it is very very hard for first time entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurs who doesn't have business background.
Right.
Like my parents they don't come from business background, they come from agriculture, farming,
Mhm.
plantation background, so they have no idea of how to build a company or something.
Right.
So, or they have no idea how to bring a capital in case if I run out of money.
Right.
So first time entrepreneurs have to have a solid team of co-founders
Mhm.
and solid investors, no going on that. And then it's very important to ensure that you build a very open culture in the company, so that
Right.
communication is very seamless. There is no interpolitics in the company, so that your message gets across. Same way the other people who have issues, that message will come very fast.
Makes
It will
sense.
not have layers of it. So we had a flat organization.
Okay.
We did not had a hierarchy.
Right.
In the corporate culture that will not work, but in a startup culture that will work, because you want quick feedback if something is going wrong,
Makes sense.
and more often than not things will go wrong,
True.
unless it has become like a $1 billion unicorn.
Mhm.
That journey, it is always better to keep the organization flat.
Right.
Flatter the organization at the founder level, you will be able to get the feedback very fast. You know where it is going wrong. If you have to make any cross correction, you can quickly make the cross correction. That is the only reason why flat organizations are important. Once it has stability, then you can build multi-department, you can build hierarchy around it,
Mhm.
you can scale around that. But initially it's always better to keep the flat organization.
Right. So you spoke about an interesting word there, culture.
Yes.
I think for any startup, culture is very important, right? So also it depends on what kind of culture you build. So one, how do you define what culture you want to build? Secondly, how do you go about building it? And thirdly, how did you make sure that the people who come into the company are actually the one who will fit that culture?
So when we looked into the aspect of culture, which is very important to define the culture. So it is very important to define the culture from the people's experience. So what we looked at it is we wanted to be humble, and we want to have the people who are like us, first time entrepreneurs who doesn't come from lot of baggage, and who are eager to prove something. There is a chip on the shoulder. There is a raw passion.
Right.
So what we look at it is those kind of people, and hiring was directly done at the founder level.
Right.
We did not outsource hiring to any hiring agency, or we did not have HR. We did not have HR even till time of acquisition. Like
Okay.
HR was only for the payroll purposes. Most of the employee increment or discussion was directly done at the level of the founders,
Interesting.
which is very important, so that we set the examples right. We listen to what is happening in the company, so that if there are any cross correction required, it's very important. And hiring is very important at the founder level, at the startup level, because as they say, the culture eats strategy for the breakfast.
Right.
You can make any kind of strategy, any kinds of plans, but if you don't have the right people at the right place, nothing gets executed.
Got it.
And to have the right people at the right place, it is the fundamental role of the founders to bring the right people.
Got it.
It is not, that is a one area that I strongly believe cannot be outsourced in the initial building of the company. It can be outsourced later point in time,
Excellent.
as let's say after 100 people or 200 people, but on the initial level, I think that's how you set the culture. You
Got it.
say culture is actually driven from the top
Okay.
by the founders.
Got it.
They set the vision, they set the culture
Right.
to the organization.
Right. So have you fired people who didn't fit the culture? And
Yes,
how did
we
you
have.
evaluate that they are not the right fit?
Well, when somebody is not fitting the culture, it's actually easy in a flat organization,
evident, okay.
because it comes up very fast.
True.
As I said, if it was a hierarchical organization, then somebody will complain to somebody will, you easily know if you're interacting one-on-one and talking to them on a day-to-day basis. You know how their performance are, you know
Right.
whether they are the right fit, whether they are gelling well with the team or not.
Right.
So other people also will talk about them. So it's easy.
Right.
We have to let go of people.
Okay. Okay.
I would say we let go instead of firing.
Fire,
So
yeah.
yeah.
Let go is a better word.
Yeah.
True. So often when people start, you don't have a choice. You hire. When you're just starting off, you don't have money. You're just not sure of the idea. You hire who is available, right? Sometimes it's because you don't have money. You hire who is a close friend, etc. Culture gets defined by the people who are your first hires, right?
Yes.
Often, a lot of us make mistakes in that aspect. We let these people drive the culture. So, at what moment you realize that I need to step in and make sure that we define a proper culture, and then the culture that you define is what gets seeped into all the employees, rather than it coming from bottom up. It has to come from top
Yes.
down. So, at what moment you realize that you need to take that step?
So that step starts from the beginning, because it doesn't matter whether you have money or not. Discipline is discipline. It's like tomorrow if I don't have money, I cannot just go and steal something.
Right.
It's like that.
Right.
So the discipline is on the day one. It is immaterial about the money.
Right.
Whether first is, yes, of course you will not be able to afford the people whom you want to bring on board, but even otherwise, the people who are coming on the initial phases, they have to make sacrifices.
Right.
Ability to make, if somebody is at, let's say, earning 100 rupees, they should be able to make the sacrifices. If they are not able to make the sacrifices, because startup is very painful journey.
Right.
Lot of times you have to let go of so many things.
Right.
So if only because of the salary, if they are coming, then you are defining it. It is good to have money problems initially, because you will be able to actually bring the right people.
True.
When you have money problems.
Right.
Because you take money out of the equation, what drives them
Makes
other
sense.
than money.
Right.
Because if money can solve all the problem,
True.
then what would have been different place? You can just throw money on it. Large
sense.
companies go belly up, who had tons of money, right?
True.
Startup wouldn't have existed there wouldn't have been disruption by, let's say, Google. When Yahoo was the conglomerate, Google was peanuts, it had no money. So money is not the problem. The discipline is important, and everybody in the initial phases who comes to the startup has to make the sacrifice. That is where it's very important that you have to have skin in the game.
Right.
The initial hire have to have skin in the game.
Makes sense.
Because if the startup fails, they have to have a direct impact on that.
Makes sense. Okay.
If people cannot compromise on the salaries, then there is no point in actually bringing them as a initial team.
Makes sense.
You can always bring them later.
Makes
Money not having enough money is actually a good problem in the initial phases, because you will get to separate the wheat from the chaff.
Yeah.
Right? If there are no problems, then startup doesn't exist.
Makes sense.
Startup is there to solve a problem.
Makes sense.
So you need to have people who can understand and look at the problem and then motivated to solve the problem.
Got it. But did you find it difficult to find such people? Because
it is very difficult. It's
getting transactional, right?
Yes, it is very difficult because you have to go to the level of comforting their parents.
Okay.
The initial hires where I had spoken to their parents and their siblings to actually ensure that what we are doing is not some Ponzi scheme.
Makes sense.
Because they don't understand. Like, you ask them to come for half or 1/4, 1/3, 10th salary, and then rest of it you are saying you are giving in ESOP or blah 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 whatever. They said, like, what is this nonsense? Like, is it just to, this guy is doing something just to underpay my kid or something, and then whack him out of money and then run away or something? Like, startup is still a very noble concept. If you move out of the bigger cities, the smaller towns, they still don't understand what is this startup, what are these ESOPs, what is this, why is somebody who is, because we generally hired people from the MTech level and hire very highly technical and capable people. So if they have to come at a
lesser salary,
lesser amount, then because their compensation is defined by not just the immediate payoff, it is defined by some future payoff.
Makes sense.
Then there are a lot of questions that has to be answered. Not just for the person who is coming, it's for their immediate family members. So sometimes it becomes a job of a founder to actually comfort all their family members.
I think in India we don't hire somebody, we hire the
family.
We hire
the family
as well. I think
India it's like we hire the family, we marry the family, we separate the family. It's always like that. It's not just one person, it's a whole enchilada package.
At some moment, actually, in my company even thought we should not just interview the candidate, we should also talk to the parents during the interview round.
Yes.
I had a thought, I did. We've not implemented it yet, but I think what you're saying is absolutely right.
Yes.
And there are companies which have done that. And I think I've read a book, I don't remember the name of the book, but then they used to even talk to the parents during the interview round, tell them what we are doing at the company, make them feel comfortable. I think because what you rightly said, right? Startups, the kind of salary I get, the company which I'm working defines a lot of things in our culture. For example, where the guy or girl gets married, a lot of things are actually looked at based on where he works.
Yes, it is particularly this though I have stories and legends of talk about, because many times when some of our people who are working in the company went for the alliances, they looked up our company whether it is approved in the bank loan department or not, and then we were not. So we had challenges on that. And many times it also happens, like people want to buy a motorbike or buy a car. Right. And when these for example HDFC or any other bank look up the credit score of a company to able to, because if you work in Infosys you can get like 5x of your salary, whatever it is for the loan. If you work in companies like ThingsCloud, you would not even get 0.5x of it. It makes fundamentally a huge difference. So all those issues are there in this. It's a journey, and then you have to comfort them. You have to talk to them because their loan gets rejected, or they went to an alliance. Their whoever they want to marry, their father felt that this company is not good enough because they suddenly come to the office to see, and then they see a small place, like what's going on? Maybe this company doesn't exist, or they're not. So there are a lot of challenges. You have multi-layered of society that you have to deal with when you are actually running a startup, that particularly in India.
True, makes sense. And I think you said hiring. So I'm sure hiring would have taken 90 to 80% of your time. Most of our time goes into hiring, defining strategies, vision. So where did you spend up most of your time as a founder?
See, most of the time as a founder, one is hiring and fundraising.
Okay.
Fundraising is also a huge time-consuming activity, and then setting up the vision, because when you hire people, you need to set up the vision so that people can really feel that the company is moving in the right direction,
Right.
or startup is moving in the right direction. And initially, that vision drives, culture drives the vision, but vision is actually comes from the top. So setting up the vision, reinforcing the vision,
Right.
because you're doing it first time. You don't have the history,
Correct.
and you as a founder lack experience. It's not, and you have no other reference point to actually look into it.
Correct.
Startup itself is much nascent in India, even though it is growing at a faster pace.
True.
Doing it as a first time entrepreneurs coming with no background, it's a much harder for you to do it. So
Right.
that is a time consuming task.
Correct.
The setting up the vision, hiring and fundraising. Fundraising itself is a mammoth task to do it. On top of it, you have to ensure that you are on track to solve the customer problem.
True. Okay.
So that in all these midst of it, you cannot lose sight on what is the customer problem that you are solving.
Makes sense.
Ensure that.
So as a hardware startup, I'm sure raising funds would have been difficult and a challenge. How did you go about doing it? And you did raise funds, and I think you did pretty well with that.
Yes. So it is challenge, but it is, as they say, it's not impossible.
Right.
So that's the only thing I can say. Like, you got to keep trying. You have to be there in a lot of places. It's probably 10 times harder than a software startup, but now because clean tech is in the boom, it's much easier.
Right.
But 4 or 5 years back, it was much harder. But again, you had to network a lot.
Right.
You have to be in the discussions with lot more people compared to a software startup or a SaaS startup.
Got it.
So that is still a challenging.
Got
And then you have to be very clear on the value proposition, because in software startup you can pivot much faster.
True.
In hardware startup you cannot pivot it.
Makes
So there will be a lot of questions. So you have to get it right.
Right.
Getting it right is very important in a hardware startup than a software startup.
Makes sense.
So
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how you grew your business. How did you acquire your customers? How do you talk about a story how you acquired your first customer, and then how do you go about defining your customer acquisition strategy?
So in terms of customer acquisition strategy, we were B2B startup. So we looked at the problem statement and we presented our customer, because our customer. So because we make the inverter products, it has to be packaged with solar panel or the batteries to sell it to the residential homeowners.
Right.
So we came back from what is the problem of residential homeowners or individual homeowners, and how are we solving it. We narrated that story to our customers, so that they can go and sell to the residential customers much easily.
Right.
So we were solving the problem of our, for example, installers or dealer distributors, so that they can go and sell the products directly to the customers
Right.
much easier. So it made it easier for us to sell to our customers.
Right. So
Because
you were able to piggyback on to the existing solar panel installers, etc.
yes.
Okay. So you never had a need to do a direct selling to a residential complex or a residential unit?
We did not go in that way.
Okay.
Yes, we did not
Got
go in that way, but we went in the distributor network.
Makes sense. So I'm not sure if you can talk about it, but who was your first B2B customer? How did you acquire them?
So our first B2B customers were there is a company called Kaja. Kaja Fir. So they were blown out by our technical value proposition.
Right.
We were able to talk about in depth of the customer problem. What are the problems that are affecting the Indian market, and why these are bigger problems, and why these problems cannot be solved by the competition.
Right. Okay.
Either the German companies or the Chinese companies or any other companies.
Right.
Because the depth of customer problem and the pulse of the customer problem, we had very fair understanding of it, and we have the technical know-how of how to solve the problem.
Got it.
So that is something that they were very impressed by that.
Got it.
And most of our customers we actually won by that way only, like
Nice.
by going into the deep of the customer problem.
So what was competition like for you, and how did you ensure that you're on top of the competition? Like how did you ensure that you?
So our competition is again the Chinese companies. They were beating down on the cost.
Right.
So we did not go in the cost game. We actually went in the value proposition.
Right.
We had a AI ML software on top of the power conversion, which they were not able to give it.
Okay.
So there was a software layer on the hardware to be able to make the differentiation.
Right.
Because without having software, it is very hard to actually just show value proposition only at the hardware level.
Got
So
it.
we were blended of hardware and software value proposition.
Got it. So let's talk about COVID a bit. I'm sure COVID would have impacted your startup, especially the fact that it's a hardware startup, right? You needed people to be in the lab to do things. So how do you manage that? It would have been a very challenging period for you.
No, COVID. So initial part of the COVID was absolutely, we came standing still in the manufacturing side, but we were able to do improvements on the software, build a strategy. When we came out of COVID, we had a demand shot up,
Right.
and we had a clear value proposition of moving forward.
Right.
And by the time the COVID was over, the boom on the clean tech and EV was very high.
Right.
Reliance came into the picture, so many other people started coming into the picture, and then the fuel price, after the COVID, fuel price hiked, everything. So it kind of, so we had impact on the COVID, lot of impact, but after the COVID we had positive impact. So
Right.
it kind of evened out.
All right.
If you had asked me during the COVID, then I would say it is pure harakiri. That's it.
Okay.
It's over, done.
Okay.
Like नहीं होगा मेरे बाप मुझे छोड़ दो, like that, because it is a we were in the middle of a production. We couldn't finish the production only during that time because it's a hardware, it's a physical hardware. People have to manufacture, and it was not considered critical item during COVID because they were manufacturing emergency equipments, healthcare equipments. So the entire production stopped. So we had absolutely very tough time during the COVID. As a startup, we had a very tough time. But we came out of it stronger.
Right.
Market demand picked up. The other part of the story on the clean tech picked up.
Right.
So it evened out.
Makes
In
sense.
hindsight, it evened out.
Got it.
In the hindsight, actually, COVID was better.
Right.
COVID made people to realize that they really need to invest on something.
Future is clean tech.
Future is clean tech. Very important. You cannot just mess up with the environment so much.
True.
So there are both aspects of it, but overall I think it evened out is what I would
Makes
say.
sense.
That.
Makes sense.
But during that time it was very harsh. Like
Right.
word came to stop.
Right.
Entire company came to stand still for almost 4-5 months.
So Amrit, now that you've been successful, rarely seen phenomena in hardware startup, but then you've been doing well, you got funded, you also got acquired recently if I'm not wrong. So what keeps you, what drives you and what's next for you?
So even though we are acquired, the impact that we set out to make it to this country, it is still not over. So that journey still keeps me.
Okay.
Because now though the size of the market has increased, so we have potential to make almost like change the life of millions of people.
Right.
So that is what driving me right now, because now we are at a bigger platform. Because we are at a bigger platform, we can scale faster, larger, better, and much more. We can go with much more force into the market.
Right.
So that is what is keeping me excited for the next level of the journey.
So people who are listening to you, and I'm sure there are a lot of people in the space of physical hardware products who are actually tuning in. What would your advice be to somebody who's getting into the space of hardware? It could be any hardware, any form of hardware. It could be a router, Wi-Fi router, or SMPS, or power supply. What's your advice to them?
So my advice, as I said earlier also, is that you have to get the product market fit fast and ensure that you don't bog down by a lot of features. Many times what happens is in the hardware space, people keep adding features and they delay the product launch.
Right.
And because of that, they will lose the critical market feedback.
Right.
And that cycle has to be very, very short for the hardware startup. It should not be more than 5 or 6 months.
Right.
And go to the market ASAP.
Right.
And get the market feedback ASAP.
Makes sense.
So that is a key thing. And have an eye on the vision, how the market is moving, and ensure that you have the right team. It's very, very important. And keeping energy in the team is most important.
Right.
And it is the founder's job to ensure that you build the right team. You cannot outsource it to anybody else.
Makes
at
sense.
least in the initial phases. That's what
Right.
I would say.
Those are some golden words, Amrut, and thank you for coming in today. I think somebody who has faced multiple challenges, and I think you've been still come out of it quite successfully. The fact that you were doing a hardware startup, you were starting up, you had to face COVID. I think you also had to find a founder as well at some point of time. Co-founder as well. Sorry, at some point of time, being able to raise money, and I think finally getting it acquired. I think you've seen the whole breadth of the journey of a startup, especially having done a hardware startup. So I think that's a commendable journey, and somebody who could be a great mentor for a lot of hardware startups, startups in general as well, I would say. So thank you for coming in today and sharing your thoughts and your ideas, and look forward to continue talking to more, and also getting more advice from you on my startup as well.
I'm humbled.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks guys for tuning in. For more such videos, do subscribe and share, and until next time, have a great day.